So now we're on to The Silurians, a serial I always quote as my favourite when asked. Now by saying this I'm of course already biased in the serial's favour, but it's one that's so well written it's easy to look at objectively. With the format of the show having been set up in the previous serial, this one has the job to make sure it can work going forwards, with Malcolm Hulke writing his first solo script for the show. It's also a 7-parter, which historically have a bit of a rocky track record, with only one real win, but this serial is definitely one of the good ones, with it perhaps being even greater than Marco Polo, but let's get into the plot to find out. So The Silurians has one of the best opening episodes, with it giving a great build up at the beginning before some lighter scenes at Unit HQ, which helps to re-establish the new status quo and introduces Bessie. Bessie being the Doctor's new mode of transport, an Edwardian roadster, with him being in the middle of tinkering with her when we first see it. Bessie will become a mainstay of this era, and especially this season. There isn't really anything to say about Bessie, at least on the serial to serial basis, but I'll probably have something to say in the season overview. So the first few episodes are built around a mystery, that being why a power drain is occurring in this new atomic power plant, and what is causing them. The first episode spends time building this up, showing the process of the drain and how it could end with a nuclear explosion, which gives us deadly stakes. Alongside this, there has been a death in a cave, with a man going mad from the experience in the cave, something that was shown to us at the very beginning of the serial. The man who's gone mad is described by the Doctor as having his mind sent back millions of years, with him drawing creatures on the walls, all of which have been extinct since the days of the dinosaurs. So this is a good opening episode, with a strong hook. We've got something happening in the caves, which the research facility is built in, with it being shown in the last moment that there is something living in them, as the dinosaur-like creature which killed the potholer attacks the Doctor. The next few episodes continue with this mystery, with them slowly revealing answers which lead to bigger questions. So I have to begin to talk about the titular Silurians now, as this is where they begin to make their presence known, although the serial holds back on them and teases them, first by showing one of them in shadow, and then only from their point of view. It isn't until the episode 3 cliffhanger that we get to see one in full, when after killing Dr. Quinn it makes its presence known to the Doctor. The build up to the reveal of the Silurians really helps to give them impact. The strong build up to the reveal of the Silurians really helps to give this moment impact. Throughout we've seen teasers of their hands, their figures in shadow and their voices. This all comes together to make the final reveal a lot more powerful than most creature reveals in the show. Their designs are awesome too. While being humanoid reptiles, they stay closer to reptile than humanoid. They have completely unique faces which have distinctive eyes and very non-human mouths. So they're alien while at the same time having a slight humanoidness to them. I think just how alien they are is important to the serial's message and the part they play in it. In this serial we meet 4 Silurians, with one being the one that was on the run who doesn't get any dialogue and disappears, presumably returns to the base but never appeared again, which is unfortunate as it could have played a bigger part in the later story, while the other 3 are unique with strong personalities, which is crucial to making them more than just monsters. So the 3 Silurians are the leader, the scientist and the young Silurian. But before I discuss each of them, I have to talk about the Silurians as a species and how they came to be living in the caves. So 100 million years ago, a small planet was approaching Earth. The Silurians calculated that the planet would tear away the atmosphere, and so in order to survive the cataclysm, they built underground shelters and put themselves into hibernation until the planet returned to normal. But the small planet did not in fact tear off the atmosphere, and instead went into orbit around the Earth, becoming the Moon. Since the atmosphere was never torn away, it meant that it never returned and the Silurians remained in hibernation. Now the obvious thing to discuss here is the origins of the Moon. So the reason for this being the reason as to why the Silurians went into hibernation was chosen because of at the time this was the most believed reason for how the Moon came into Earth orbit. Now it was only later that same decade when this was disproven, with the fated collision becoming the most agreed upon reason. But despite this, the show has stuck to the Moon being a small planet which is captured by Earth's gravity, which both separates the Doctor Who universe from our own, but at the same time could actually explain why life is so more prominent in that universe, while it's seemingly rare to non-existent in ours. This is probably worth a larger discussion in its own video, but it's an interesting thing to consider. On their revival, with the research facility being constructed and generating power, it allowed the Silurians to begin being revived by draining power from the facility, but upon awakening they learned what was once their planet was now ruled by apes, who they saw as primitive back when they ruled. And this is the conflict of the serial. Who is the true owner of the Earth, with the Doctor stuck in the middle? On the Silurians themselves, the 3 prominent ones are better defined than perhaps any villains we've seen so far. Beginning with the leader, he is an older Silurian who initially shares the same opinion of humanity as the rest of his species, seeing the humans as primitives, but upon meeting the Doctor and talking with him, his mind has changed, realising that Earth is now humanity's planet and is willing to seek peace. This doesn't end up happening as the young Silurian learns of this and has a hatred for humanity, so kills the leader and takes over, with plans to eliminate humanity. The young Silurian is the evil one of the Silurians we meet. This is entirely due to his own prejudices, viewing humanity as what they were when he was on the surface, still seeing them as the primitive apes instead of giving them a chance to show what they are now. This hatred of humanity is so ingrained into his beliefs, where he learns of the leader helping the Doctor and deciding to give peace a chance, he kills him and takes command, although even before that he was taking action against humanity by infecting Major Baker with a disease that had the potential to wipe out all of humanity. The young Silurian is the main villain of the story, but only because he is directly against humanity's survival. This serial tries strives to keep away from a black and white view of good and evil, with the Silurians being presented as a diverse race, with the serial showing us both good and evil ones, alongside the scientist who basically just goes along with whoever is in charge. That's all there is to say about the scientist. He is basically a servant to whoever is in charge, or at least the most dominant of the time, as he does conspire against the leader when the young Silurian decides to take control, although that decision is also influenced by the fact that the young Silurian does threaten him, which means he isn't exactly loyal and probably just wants to experiment and do his own research. But this diverse view of the Silurians is something the show doesn't go into with its villains, which does make the Silurians both stand out against the hordes of others and gives the audience a reason to be on their side or consider things from their point of view. They have as much right to this place as we do, but neither of us can look past what the other looks like to give peace a try and see each other as a form of monster that needs to be exterminated. By humanising the creatures, it allows for the humans to be villainised, not because they're necessarily evil, but because they stand against the survival of another species who we can relate to and understand. On the heroes, or at least the humans, we've got a big cast. So let's start with the guest cast and the people who work at the research facility. So since I've mentioned Quinn, let's talk about him. So Dr. Quinn was one of the head scientists at the research facility, with him being in charge of the cyclotron. Initially he seems to serve the job of being the person to explain the sciencey stuff, and being the only one that seemed helpful with UNIT's investigation. This turns out to be a facade, as he is the one who discovered the Silurians while potholing, and is helping them to gain their scientific knowledge. Quinn's role in the story is somewhat small, as he is only in the first 3 episodes, but he's very important as apart from naming the Silurians, his desire for their greater knowledge is what leads to his death, while also putting a lot of others at risk, as he doesn't give up anything about the Silurians and does what he can to cover up their existence from UNIT. His self-interest is what leads to his death, with him being quite egotistical at times, although the Doctor can see right through him from near the beginning and does offer his help, which is refused. Quinn does show off a bad side to humanity because of this, showing no care for the Silurians as a species and seeing them only as something to gain from, which makes his death not satisfying, but it feels somewhat deserved after his actions, especially in retrospective when we understand the Silurians better. Major Baker is up next, an ex-soldier who is now head of security. He approaches the Silurians in a very militaristic way, first thinking they're saboteurs and eventually seeing them as the enemy, something which isn't helped by him being held captive and interrogated by them. Compared to Quinn, he has a very different view of them, with him just seeing them as the enemy to be destroyed, rather than looking at them for either who they are or any gain. This occurring during the stretch of the story when the Silurians are being characterised works well, as it kind of shows the problem of the military mind to shoot first and ask questions later. Baker is a somewhat tragic character. He is far more dedicated to the quest to find the saboteurs to the point of being blinded by it. This due to some undescribed event that happened in his past, which left its mark on him. While he does get his lighter moments, notably with Liz, the majority of his screen time is him dedicated to finding the saboteurs, which leads to his capture and eventual death. Next we have Dr. Lawrence, who is the head of the entire facility and the show's first anti-vaxxer. Lawrence is completely against the presence of UNIT and sort of goes insane towards the end as his entire career is ruined by the events of the story. Right from the beginning he immediately shows a disdain towards the presence of UNIT, which is worsened by the Doctor's appearance, who shows him even less respect from their first meeting. Throughout he is standoffish and constantly in the way of UNIT doing their job, with him calling in a man from the ministry to get them out of his way so he can continue his work. He is entirely self-centered, showing no respect for anyone else, even his highest ranking staff, entirely because he knows how their actions will reflect on him and affect his career in the long run, which is his entire motivation. He's the longest lasting of the supporting cast, with him dying towards the end, his death coming from a disease which he refuses to believe in the existence of, even when he clearly was ill. This just speaks to how self-centered he is, seeing the disease as something made up just to put a stop to his work and ruin his career, bringing him full circle in a way. There are a few other small characters, notably Masters and Miss Dawson. Neither of them are the biggest characters, but serve their purpose. Masters does double duty as he serves as the ministerial figure, who the characters can call an idiot for not doing anything, and point blank refusing to look at the evidence, something which comes up a lot in Hulk scripts, and also the one to spread the disease outside of the research facility. Miss Dawson is there to be the worrier, with her being close to Dr. Quinn, somewhat trying to act as his conscience, but not getting through to him, with his death shaking her, before just sort of disappearing. Finally we have the main cast, who are all strong. The Doctor is of course the outsider who has the interests of everyone at heart, with him trying to create peace between the two races but ultimately failing. It's a great showing for this incarnation and really sets in stone a lot of his characterisation, notably his search for a peaceful solution to any situation rather than the bloodier approach. His ability to be objective during the serial is important, as it allows for us to see both sides of the conflict through his eyes more clearly. Now technically he is technically on the side of humanity. This is mostly because he is just seen as an ape like the rest of humanity, because he looks like them, but also because he has to keep them safe from the Silurians when they spread the disease. This also allows him to show off his scientific side, with him taking a practical approach to the situation, with him spending the entirety of episode 6 in a lab working on finding a cure. Pertwee's performance really adds to this, as he plays the Doctor very seriously, with only occasional comic relief. This works well with the dialogue to make this serial feel very serious, which heightens it. Next we have Liz, who is also great. While having the Doctor from the beginning does mean that she doesn't get any scenes early on where she is the only scientific force, the serial still uses her quite well. She spends a lot of time doing research or assisting the Doctor, either during the potholing when they find the Silurian base, or when they're trying to find a cure to the disease, with her being the one to figure out which of the Doctor's notes was the correct formula following his disappearance. In some ways she is a bit less important than the previous serial, but she still feels strong throughout, with her being the people person of the main trio. She plays off the Doctor well, with her being able to put him in his place at times due to her own scientific knowledge, which makes them a fun pairing. Finally we have the Brigadier, who is somewhat different from his previous appearances, not because he's less serious, but because we see a bit more of an edge to him. The edge coming from a scene at the end, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. He also serves as the face of UNIT again, as while there is a captain in this serial, the Brig still fights on the front lines and leads the advance into the caves on several occasions. Making him more into a leader who's willing to lead his men into danger rather than sitting around for the most part does help. Even though we did see this a bit in the previous serials, this was mostly contained in the final episode, but here he is a force throughout. There isn't as much to his dynamic with the Doctor as the last one, but it doesn't matter as we're seeing more of the Brig in action and having to deal with the worldwide threat that the Silurians pose. Now I want to discuss the Cold War of sorts between the two factions. So the serial presents both sides with shades of grey, not committing to either being good or bad. Both do things that provoke the other and neither is necessarily worse. The Silurians seem worse, but that's mostly because they have technology on their side, which they're able to use to gain the advantage, being much more effective at killing with their third eye alongside having the disease which could wipe out all of humanity, and the use of a machine that could destroy the Van Allen belts, which would wipe out all of humanity, and scientifically speaking it's very unlikely they would have survived. The fact that the humans lack this sort of weaponry and don't really have anything as effective for this conflict makes them seem definitely weaker, which does lessen them as a threat. The final scene of this serial just shows how far humanity is willing to go though. While the majority of the serial has shown them on the back foot, with the Doctor having made the Silurians retreat into hibernation, the Ministry make their orders clear to the Brigadier.
Brigadier, he's blown up a Silurian base. They were intelligent alien beings. A whole race of them. He's just wiped them out.
The fact that we know the Brig wanted to wait until the Doctor was long gone from the area before acting makes this hurt more, as he clearly knows the effect it was going to have on him, and yet still had to follow his orders. This does create a divide between them, but that isn't touched on until the next serial. This is a big scene from the serial which shows how dangerous humanity actually are to things they fear, making the Silurians into the victims after everything they've done, and it's perhaps the most powerful scene in Doctor Who up to this point. So I've only one or two things to talk about with the behind the scenes. The first being that this was the first serial to be overseen by Barry Letts, who took over from Derek Sherwin as the show's producer. Now I'll talk about him more in later serials and his later seasons, as this one mostly sticks to the format from the Invasion and Spearhead, while we'll see his mark fully made later on, although his era would continue with some of the style and a similar format to these early ones. But the change will be gradual, so the next season will be his time to shine. The next thing is that since this was shot on videotape, it marks the first serial to be recorded in colour, as the previous serial was filmed. This also meant that it was now possible for the production to use a new technique called CSO, or Colour Separation Overlay, which would allow for a background to be replaced with an image from another source, with this serial using it for the dinosaur and a few other visuals, notably the monitor which is used by the Silurians. But on colour, this is the first serial to have had its colour restored. To explain this, while the purple era exists, some episodes only existed in black and white, which technically meant that they were classed as missing in a way. This meant that when it came to releasing these episodes on DVD, they had to have the colour restored if possible. So there are many ways to do this, which we'll explore as we cover these serials, but the one used of the Silurians was a method which allowed for the colour signal of a low quality colour off-air recording to be combined with the higher quality image signal from a black and white copy. Now I don't fully understand the technical side of this at all, but it's very interesting and feels somewhat like magic as to how it was achieved. Of course the final result isn't as clean as the original colour versions would have been, but it allows for a higher quality colour version which does still look great. I do have to note this one oddity though because it's so odd, and I don't know if it was from the original recording or something which happened during the restoration process, but a part of the credits appears for a decent chunk of the opening of episode 6. It's very faint and I didn't notice it until my most recent rewatch, but it's such an odd thing. How it happened is so weird and one of those mysteries I want to know the answer to. I originally thought it was a problem with my DVD, but no, it's on the versions on BBC iPlayer. Maybe I should check out one of the VHSs. But the final thing I have to address is the serial's title, as naming this review will be a complete pain if I don't. So this serial is weirdly called Doctor Who and The Silurians, which is something completely unique. Now this was a mistake which led to the "and" being present, but it makes it the only story in the show's history to actually have Doctor Who in the title. Although it's basically just known as The Silurians these days, in a similar vein to The Massacre. But the question is, do I call this review Doctor Who and The Silurians, or Doctor Who and The Silurians? So The Silurians is an amazing serial. It gives us creatures who are not black and white, which makes it hard to call them villains, while the humans feel more like the villains. The biggest problem is that it doesn't exist in its original colour version, but calling that a problem is nitpicking. Throughout, the serial is strong, giving us plenty of varied characters and creatures who are characters in themselves. The serial's dedication to giving us a conflict which has two fully fleshed out sides is commendable, and really makes it stand out. At the start I called this my favourite serial, and right now that still holds true. But next time, with no contact from Mars Probe 7, a rescue attempt leads to a conspiracy, which puts the world in danger of an alien invasion, with the 3 astronauts seeming to be in the middle of everything. Next time, the Ambassadors of Death.